So thank you for the introduction. And my talk will be about robust visual recognition, and actually only a few aspects, because robustness is a complex topic. And also, this lecture is a mixture of like giving some background, some basic things, and relating to some recent work we have done in related to robust visual recognition, because this is also a summer school and a symposium, so there could be hugely varying levels of background knowledge. So, okay. So now this thing does not work. I don't know why. Let's see. I'll do it manually.
You can use the arrows maybe.
No, because I touched the pad, but I think this thing, okay, now it works. Okay, so computer vision has had many successes, especially in last years, and also failures, and this is some random selection. So for instance, if you look at this YOLO video, you can see that 10 years ago this would be unimaginable, near real-time detection, localization of many objects. We have now scene text OCR, and probably many of you have Google Lens installed on your phones, and it does recognize incredible things. We can do 3D reconstruction, and probably those who are interested in this are aware of the CallMap method, which gets as input a set of images taken from fairly arbitrary positions, and you get a 3D reconstruction. We are very good in modeling humans with SMPL. So we've also had some failures, like autonomous driving, where there has been some fatal accidents, the handling of long tail. So somehow the machine learning based things it's very difficult to make them work in all arbitrary situations, which are difficult to see, let's say, anticipate. I will talk about domain shifts, which are, I would say, omnipresent in machine learning based approaches, and also vision is somehow prone to adversarial attacks. Well, one more example of some very impressive superhuman ability is this license plate reading, where what is being read here on the right is not the car in the front, but is the car in the back. So this is an example where computer vision has reached superhuman ability. And the same thing here, scene OCR and a human face and iris identification is now at a level that probably surpasses any human. They are big, yeah. So the talk is about robust vision. And in computer vision, the term robust refers to the ability to operate in the widest range of conditions. And it's very difficult for people, researchers, especially young ones, to imagine what this means. So you think that we have a paper called Tracking Any Point, but I ask you to track two people holding a mirror, or some monitor which is displaying something, or transparent surfaces, bubbles, wires, and so on. We talk about perfect, near perfect recognition, but you look even in the data, and you see if you go into fine-grained many classes, it's problematic. So robustness in computer vision is a little bit different than in statistics. In statistics, essentially, you make certain assumptions, and if they are violated, say mildly, you would like your performance to stay the same. In computer vision, the main problem is that something that you haven't thought about has appeared in front of the camera where you are supposed to operate. So almost all of current computer vision, those successes I talked about, are based on machine learning, in particular deep learning. So how do we proceed? In a sense, when 20 years ago, you had people who are specialists in segmentation, people who are doing tracking, people who are doing recognition, people who are doing reconstruction, and in some way the deep learning shift has made life easier for researchers because things converge. These days, for almost any problem, You collect your training data, you pick your model, you define your loss, and then you run an optimizer which tries to find a set of weights, model parameters, that minimize the loss on a validation split of the training data. Yeah?
Sorry to interrupt. We have to share the Zoom presentation. Sorry everyone for the interruption. It's like the first minute.
So now it's doing what it's supposed to do. Okay, so I'll be talking today about recognition, and in recognition we are almost always training with cross-entropy loss function, but the evaluation metric is top 1 accuracy typically, sometimes top 3, top 5 accuracy. So there is this best practice where you would like to do an evaluation metric and regularization is somehow not adhered to in this case. And we make a common assumption that we have IID training and test data. So IID means that you assume that your test and training data are identically distributed. Drawn, which means that there is some generator of data which is drawing samples from the world, and there are some observation data and some label data, which would be the classes. Now, I argue that this is almost never the case in deployment of an ML system. The only way you can create an IID situation is that you collect your data, you shuffle the data, and then you split it randomly artificially. Now, why is that? Because, think about the problem of human face recognition. People get older. Some people move from your, new people are born, people die. Same thing with animal re-ID, car recognition, car make recognition, new models appear all the time. The relative frequency of certain types is changing all the time. So this somehow has consequences, and if any one of you is involved in benchmarking and evaluation, I'm saying that we should do what we call a temporal split. So the only realistic split is to get data and at a certain moment say this is the end of training, and now we start deployment, and the training split is the older thing, and deployment is done with newer data. Yeah? Okay, so I will be talking about 3 ways where robustness could be sort of improved compared to the standard practice, and this is maybe one of the 3 formal slides here. So what we'll do when we are learning a deep network, doesn't matter whether it's a CNN on transformer, at the level of the loss function, we are here minimizing the cross entropy. Usually we are training, what is this? So this is overall classes or all examples, all classes. So usually we have a perfectly labeled data. So for this K would be the indicator function for the class of the example I, and we are minimizing the log of the softmax output. And then we treat it And when we are doing deep learning, we still do pattern recognition. We should try to aim at optimal decision making. And this implies that we are assuming that the output of the softmax is, roughly speaking, is good approximation of the posterior probability of the observation. Now, normally, this assumption is not correct, and we'll talk about that. The second thing I will talk about is domain shift. So domain shift, which we touched a second ago, can have different forms which pose different types of problems. So the domain shift means that the training data were drawn from a distribution that is different than the target distribution, the deployment, where your system will be evaluated and your user will assess its performance. So I will focus only on this prior shift. So in prior shift, your objects, or so identity, say conditional probabilities, so think about this as perhaps observation of a phase-given identity or observation of an image given class label. So this could be a distribution of, let's say, cars, pedestrians, which are common objects that we like to analyze. So it's the same in the test and training data, but the prior has changed. So perhaps you had your system deployed, evaluated in some place on a square where you have lots of people and very few cars, or and then it's deployed in a place which is very different. Now, this case, these three cases are the concept shift. The concept shift is when the probability posterior change is given x. So for instance, if you see an image of a telephone from the 1980s and a telephone from now, the visual resemblance is very weak. So I think this problem, if you want to be robust, you have to expect domain shift, and I will talk about the simplest case, which is a prior shift. Of course, all these things are related because of this base formula, which can express the joint probability in a prior times conditional, or also the probability of observing a certain input times the posterior. Okay, and one last thing before I will go into the technical methods I want to talk about. I will say that I would recommend people to look in the open set formulation, not the closed sets. In a closed set, someone gives you an image or a bounding box, and you say, well, I want, there's output the species identifier, so a class label. But in fact, in almost all practical examples, you should include the class unknown, because if you might think that you are doing a classifier into classes of animals, but you can be sure that some of your users will show something which does not have the animal. So use open set formulation. So I will talk about three problems which can robustify visual recognition. One thing is dealing with prior shift. The second is dealing with non-zero losses. So non-zero one loss means that different mistakes have different consequences. And the last thing I will show that you can robustify visual recognition by foreground background separation, and this will address what is now called this spurious correlations, and I'm showing that all these methods actually could be replaced by a simple step before you recognize. So dealing with prior shift. So imagine that you are developing an application for mushroom recognition. And this is a distribution, this is from Denmark. There's a data set for this, which has this DF20, Danish Fungi 2020 is the year it was established, the data set, not the number of classes, there are many more. You see that for certain mushrooms like Boletus, they do not grow at all in the winter in Denmark. So if you are preparing an application how will you represent this knowledge? So many mushrooms are visually fairly similar, and of course if you do not use this prior, you are making many more mistakes than you could. Now, of course the prior, it depends not only on the time of year, but also on the location. You have elevation changes, something close to sea, far away from sea. You can have a description of the environment. So you are in a deciduous forest, or you might be on some grassy land. So I will ignore this min-max training for the moment because it's not used very often. And the question is, how do I develop a system that will be able to deal with this type of changes or exploit the knowledge? So if you do the classical thing, well, you will create some mixture of these three classes in your training set, and your classifier will be, at best, optimal for the percentages that you represent in the training set. And this is an example how, if you look at some data from about 3 selected data sets, you see that the domain shift, even on the training and validation set, is very different, which is sort of weird that the people who are designing these data sets did it that way. So they're saying, okay, maybe the training set represents the natural frequency, so many natural phenomena follow what this Zipf's law, which is sort of roughly exponential. So you see that there's a few very common things and then a long tail of less and less common classes. And then for the validation, and often this is happening for the test, they give you a uniform distribution. So you are training to minimize the average weighted with this curve on the training, then to be validated on something very different. I think that this means that people do not understand that it's to be optimal on the uniform distribution is different from being optimal on some specific prior distribution of the classes, unless you are perfect, which is zero loss. So I will introduce the concept of calibration, which we'll need in dealing with the zero, non-zero, one losses, is that a classifier is fully calibrated if the output of the classifier is indeed equal to the probability of classifying X correctly. So if an observation X generates an output, let's say for 4 classes, of 80, 15, 1, and 4%, which means that class number 1 is 80% likely, it means that the relative frequency, if we have many of such examples which generate this output, we indeed should observe an 80% success rate for top 1 accuracy. Now, this is different from, the calibration is different concept from accuracy. You can have if you have for some X, you can have a 2-class classifier 50-50, which is as good as a tossed coin, but actually if for this input, indeed it's correct at 50% time, it's well calibrated. And the problem is that if CNNs are often overconfident, so you should not assume this upfront, and in many cases you should use the validation set not only to stop your learning, but to check this condition. And so often, even on validation data, the CNN will give you 1 or the softmax will give you 1 for one particular class, and this will be much more than the actual probability of the class of the decision. This is the decision given X, so it will be much bigger. And there are, maybe first thing, there is before I will introduce a simple method that I suggest you use because it costs you almost nothing, is that there is a gap between, so if a classifier predicts that it has a 60% accuracy actually in some tests, it's much lower, it's like 40%. And this gap is this overconfidence gap. Yeah? So the confidence, this thing is what you are predicting to happen. This is the actual observation. On it, you can measure the accuracy. So this is either for every sample in the test set, the sample is either correctly classified or incorrectly. So here are sort of measuring the accuracy, but that should be equal to the probabilities, so the sum of probabilities of correctness. Yeah? And there is almost always a gap. So a very simple method has been proposed, and you know that for most recognition or classification type of networks, the final stage is a softmax. So the softmax takes real-valued inputs, this axis, and then makes sure that they are positive and summing to 1 by applying this formula. It's called softmax because, of course, if something is much larger than, if one xk is larger than the others, it will dominate and everything else will be 0, and this large value exponentiated will be normalized to 1. Okay, and it turns out that at least for the calibration of the top value, you have one parameter here which sort of makes the sharpness of this softmax. And that one parameter, which is easily optimized on the validation set, can calibrate. And you'll see how we need this. So if we want to do decisions with 0-1 losses. Okay, this can be slightly generalized with now here, but this is now adding so many parameters as you have classes, so it becomes more difficult. So calibrate or classify will cost you nothing. Now, let's say we have a calibrated classifier and we want to adjust to new priors. And let's say we know that. We know that on the training set we had a flat prior. So that means the user who will use our system gave us a training set where you had 10 examples from every class. But we know that in deployment, the probabilities will be very different. So we assume that, let's assume the simplest case, the domain shift only in the prior, that our objects have not changed in test time and deployment. So I'm sampling, maybe let's think about animal identification system or recognition system, and this is the distribution of appearances of an animal, like of distribution of images of an animal from class K. And that distribution, like this conditional probability, has not changed. I'm taking exactly the same images from the same group of zebras like I had it in the training set. This part is what my classifier, this is the posterior, this is what the deep net was trying to estimate. And I never really cared in the training set to estimate the probability of certain observation or certain class. But if this stays the same, and my evaluation, the test time probabilities have changed, so I have moved now in my system, zebra observations are not 10% but 50%, then if this stay the same, and these two quantities changed, then I have to change the decision of my classifier. So and the relation simple manipulation says, okay, if I trained a classifier on a test training set which has a different prior than the evaluation test or test situation, I have to reweight the output of the trained classifier by this ratio. There is a proportionality because, of course, this ratio could be, I don't know, 100 to 1. Why people get away with not doing it? Because often if this number is really peaked around, say, 0.99, then the factor here doesn't, if it's 5 to 1, it cannot overwhelm this factor. But if you want to be precise, and in many applications and ambiguous situations this is important, this is what you should do. So there are two cases. Sometimes you know the prior. So for instance, in many countries, you have a license plate system where the first letter sometimes defines the region. So of course, if in Thessaloniki all license plate starts with T, the prior for that first letter is very different than in Athens. And you know that when you deploy your recognition system, you want to have that modified there. Or you can estimate it. And this is the interesting thing. You can estimate this change from the data you have. And maybe I will some hint at one method, which is very simple. You use the confusion matrix. So what is a confusion matrix? Confusion matrix is an estimate of the probability of making a decision I if the true class is K. So on your validation set, this is easy to estimate. And it turns out that if you invert the confusion matrix, then you can turn your estimate of your decision. So you are operating a system and it makes certain decisions. You are measuring you are estimating the probability of a decision. I don't know, zebra, antelope, tiger. And if you know, which you estimated on the training data, the confusion matrix, its inverse will give you an estimate of your priors, and you can plug it into this form. So it is possible on the fly to estimate the prior probability and adjust. Perhaps this is also changing, like to do this estimate, you need to have a series of tests. And in common practice, we have set up the benchmarks like this. I give you an object, you classify it, I tell you right or wrong, and you forget it. Whereas to estimate that, you are saying, I remember all my decisions. This is how we, if you start doing this type of classification at a waterhole like a human somewhere in Africa, you are observing the animals, you are changing your estimates, and then in dark conditions where this thing will become not so peaked, you want to use that prior. You will be guessing, you will be using the prior more and more, and you will estimate the prior on your previous observations. So again, this goes into a change in the way we should look at testing systems, training data, and then the test data is presented in a certain order, and I'm allowing the system to remember its decisions, okay? Of course, I'm not giving the true labels, but at least the decisions, because that allows us to protect ourselves from changing in the prior distribution. Okay, and then it shows in some example that we saw on the data set with the fungi where you can know this month. If you know the month and you know where it was collected, you change the priors and you reduce the error by, so here the error was 11%, and if you add this 3% and something, you will go to 8%. So this is like cutting off every fourth error. Just nothing to do with essentially with computer vision, but just properly handling the prior. So now the loss matrix. So imagine, and this is where the calibration will come back. Imagine you are asked to recognize automatically a snake. Some snakes are venomous, some are not. There are 5 million snake bites a year, and in India, which is the hotspot of the problem, you have 5 deaths an hour. So it kills 80,000, 400,000 people are disabled each year. Now, and it happens like in a place where there is perhaps no expertise. So what you really want to do is to have a reliable app for snake recognition. Now, let's say that you are not able, because the snakes are not so easy to recognize. Animals usually, some animals try to have like camouflage and so on. If you have a venomous snake and non-venomous, then if you look at the performance of your system, you would like to have everything on the diagonal, which means like, this is a ground truth. So if I have a snake, Daboia, okay, I would like to have everything here. But what I have to be really careful about, if my ground truth is venomous and I make a decision for non-venomous, the cost of that decision is death or maybe severe health problems to the person. So the errors here and the errors there are very different. So how can we treat this? So the standard way, which ignores the costs, is exactly what we do most of the time. We say, okay, train my CNN, possibly on data where the prior is unrelated to the correct prior at the place and time where the bite took place, and make the decision for the most likely class and treat if K is venomous. A case B, which is better, is that, okay, calculate the posterior probabilities, okay, there should be P, the probabilities of all the venomous snakes, and if this is more likely than that, which means the probability of a non-venomous snake, treat. But of course, the mistake of this is the ratio of costs, where you say, okay, I will treat if the probability of the venomous multiplied by the cost ratio is greater than the probability of being okay. So imagine it's only 5% venomous snake probability. So I don't care about the top one anymore. I just want to know what is the total probability of a venomous class being responsible for that bite. And if this is, say, not, so multiply by 100 perhaps, because the cost of administering needlessly antivenom is 100 times smaller than letting the person die because we sort of overlook the danger. So this W would express that thing, and this is what we should be doing. But of course, if we want to do this, this has to be interpreted as probabilities. Yeah, I think sort of this K here is the output. Yeah, so here there's a mistake that the K star is the name of the class, but here it's in this part, K is the estimated probability of a given class, K sub I. Okay, so if we run, and this is just an example, if we run the classical method, and we have, this is from some real data, we have ground truth, venomous, non-venomous. If it looks quite good, like we are only overlooking, so this thing is decision non-venomous on venomous. So 2% of the venomous snakes are set as non-venomous, but this actually translates to, say, 724 deaths. And if we have a 0-1 loss, we say, okay, we minimize the 0-1 loss means I minimize the number of mistakes. So then, okay, nothing happens, my loss function is quite good. But if I say 0-100 loss, so 0 is I make a correct decision, these are these two. 1 means I'm administering a needlessly antivenom. This is here, this is the 800. And then 100 for every person that does not get treated, I give him 100, then the total loss is very high. Now, if we are making a decision based on argmax, then because the softmax is just a monotonic transformation, even the calibration is a monotonic, the top one class is the same and nothing changes. Whereas if you start making even the case B, where you are interpreting the output of the classifier as a probability, then already it starts making a small change, because now not only the top one class is important. Often the changes are small because usually the top one class is much more likely than the others. But look what happens if we do C. So if you remember, these numbers were 70,000 here. So if you start deciding based on 0, 1, and 100, let's say, cost function, your total cost, your decision making will change, and you will start avoiding the very costly, not treated person bitten by a venomous snake, and you have reduced the total cost by sixfold. So it's an important case. So the lesson from this is, don't adopt the 0-1 cost automatically, and if you want to do correct minimization of the losses, you need to be calibrated, because they are treating the output of the deep network as a probability. Okay, and here in some sense the cost function is available. So in practical applications, very often the cost functions are not known. By the way, what we found is surprising, that the cost is also location specific, because in some countries they do not store the antivenom for a given snake bite. Okay, but so this is the summary which I gave a second ago. Do not go for 0-1 always. Okay, the second part of the talk is about the role of background and foreground in visual recognition. So you see a lot of work these days about something like spurious correlations. People say, essentially they're saying, I'm doing attention maps. I'm doing a lot of things to prevent my classifier to use the background for decisions. And we are arguing this is suboptimal. Look at these 5 cases. I don't know whether to, okay, let's start from left. So imagine you want to know the name of this dog and that dog. If they did not have the owner connected to them, I think that you will have B 50-50. So this is an example where the background, not the object itself, is critical for identification. This is an example where the background helps to identify that this is a bear which is herbivorous. It's one of the few bears that eat leaves. And in this difficult view, you might not know. It helps you in improving your accuracy. In this case, which is from some sort of a shop website, the background is uninformative. Now the interesting parts are here. So if you have generated content, we know that, I think it's like most of you would say, oh, this is a dolphin on the moon, and you see the dolphin, and you have never seen a dolphin on the moon, and it's in no training data sets. So the generated background can be arbitrary, and this example is then the background is misleading. So this is from some photo. For those who are animal lovers, they will know this is not a snow leopard. It's a cheetah in a very rare, like once in a few years event where it snowfalls in South Africa. So the point is that the background could be critical, And both background and foreground contribute to the visual object recognition. So, by the way, the word background means pixels not observing the object. So in some sense, this is the foreground, this leaves. It's occluding the bear, but it's something unrelated to the bear. So somehow we feel that essentially anything can appear on any background. So that would say, don't use the background. But this one tells you, use the background. So the question is, how can we get best of both worlds? Okay, so maybe to bring the message home, you would think that if I give you that and ask you which one of the four it is, it's actually quite difficult. But if I showed you the picture here, here and here from the context, you use it all the time. So people use the background. If I tell you what is this, we manipulate the image, and in fact it's the apple. So nobody would tell you it's an apple. Even the state-of-the-art VLMs get this wrong. So large language models are very impressive. VLMs like CLIP are super impressive. But if this thing loses context, it will tell you it's a plug. Now, this thing is an apple, but in the context of the, if you put the background, the tennis racket, the background will sort of lead it to make a conclusion this is a tennis ball. By the way, it's not because it's sort of seeing the tennis racket. If you know the paper with the red circle, if you put a red circle around the apple saying, I really want you to answer on the apple, it still gets you a tennis ball. So it's an interesting problem where we see that we need to use the background, but we would like to be robust. Okay, and then maybe this is just like to show you not everything can be done by learning. Some people think most problems in computer vision are done by insufficient training data. If I get more and more data, my problems will go away. Like sometimes, I think there's a quote, anecdotal quote from Google, like if you train on everything, you don't have the problem with generalization because you've seen everything. But you have not seen things which have not yet been generated yet. Okay, so what do we propose? We propose that these days, and this was triggered by this segment anything paper, which actually does not, and we had huge problems with it, but segment anything. So these days, if we can agnostically, before we know what this is, segment the foreground and background, then you can process the foreground and let's say the full picture with the context separately. And you can even use metadata. So the metadata could be location. This is coming back to the prior. So if this was indeed in North America, if the location of this image is North America, the cheetah probability is very, very small because from the visual data it's not clear. So, and then you can have a robust fusion. And I believe, or we believe now, that the robust fusion for humans is something like this. If the foreground is obvious, don't touch the background, and if the foreground is ambiguous, like low light conditions, heavy occlusion, and so on, then you have to rely on the full, where the full has the background. It turns out that we are using the full image because it's simpler than the background. Because we can use, let's say, models that have been pre-trained. And then this can be made robust, and the foreground here says it's a cheetah, whereas the full image says a snow leopard because it's incorrectly using the background. Now, it turns out that this class agnostic object segmentation and detection is an open problem, but OWL does a very good job and we sort of recommend it. So in here we are saying we can segment objects before knowing what they are, And if we segment them before knowing what they are, we can robustly figure out what they are. I'm not sure how many of you like to go to the zoo, but very often in this pavilion of amphibians and snakes, you look into that box and you see nothing. And until you first have to segment the thing, and then indeed it's becoming possible to recognize. So in some sense, we are coming back like to the 80s, like 50 years back, when people said, well, if we could segment, then life would be easy. And now we are in a position with all these huge models. This is like open vocabulary, open dictionary, which is sort of almost the same thing like generic. Yeah. But besides, it gives you some more things. So occlusion behaves more or less the same way like changes of background. So if you segment the giraffe, you can also use, immediately the segmentation gives you a silhouette, and this is very robust because you can do things like recognition in backlight, low light conditions, and so on. So this is apparently one of a few giraffes without this tiled texture. It's some sort of anomaly. And the shape, you can recognize it because of the shape. So this decomposition, we are not doing this at the moment, but the decomposition allows you to also be completely insensitive to changes of texture, which also means changes to illumination. It turns out that we can get, why we are not doing it, because it turns out that class agnostic segmentation is not there. Like, you can get a class agnostic bounding box reliably. So what is class agnostic means? I don't know what is here, but put all boxes around those things which are there. Of course, if you have something like YOLO, then you have 80 predefined classes, but we want to say in general we want to do this before we know what it is. And this is another example where we are using this principle of segment before you make a decision. So this is an example of a paper which was recently accepted to ICCV, that if you try to detect and estimate the pose of the players here, the detector gets one something. Actually, it merges the two players, the two heads are part there. If you then fit the model, pose model, it gets it right. If you segment the player, then you turn this structured occluder, which is very similar to the background, into something which is wiped out, cleaned out. Then you have a detector which tries to segment again. You can recover people that you couldn't before. So I think this segmentation, so this is about interaction between detection and segmentation. And the segmentation has progressed so much that we can do things these days before. It also allows you to model the background at rather than appearance level, at some sort of more conceptual level. So if you are training data with a classical method, you have to present, say, the animal on all sorts of backgrounds, and you are learning the foreground and background together, all combinations, and also you have this danger of these spurious correlations. Whereas if you say, okay, the background should be classified at a very high level as a location or maybe class, it gives you more advantages. Okay, so this is an example how what happens. So if you, this is from a data set of lynx identity recognition. So lynx is a protected species. There are very few of them. Poachers like them, so they have to be protected. And if you train on this lynx data set from the paper, for this lynx, this is the attention map. Classical background, spurious background. This lynx appears very often at this trap. This was a typical part. Of course, if that lynx moves to another location, you will never recognize it. Okay, removing the background. Okay, then yes, by coincidence, your performance almost stays unchanged, but you are not using the prior that certain links does not show up at every camera trap with equal likelihood. If you use the priors, then it increases the accuracy by 12%. So this is an example of using the background. Here we don't have to use the background because we know the location from the camera GPS. So here you have together the fact that background could be spurious. So if you have this type of attention map, it's certain that when the link shows in an unknown new location, which they do, then you are lost. This shows if you ignore the background, okay, you will have a better generalization, but you don't get better because you ignore the fact that the prior is not uniform. And then if you put it together, it's important and you get a big boost in performance. Now, it's interesting that this background suppression has been, there are many papers, like many papers on how to actually get rid of the background bias, but it's not. It's like it has to be properly modeled. And then some long time ago, people started to study that they recognize that, for instance, for human object recognition, you need the background in the context, let's say in in ambiguous situations. But these were only sort of theories, and it's not part of, let's say, common way of training or dealing with classifiers. But methods that would model this relationship, they are sort of not yet there. So just an example, let's say some examples of how this works in practice. So there are data sets where they say, like, okay, we will play with the background to show you that using the background is what you don't want to do. So it's funny that they see that they take some subset of the ImageNet. By the way, that's another story, that ImageNet has like a very large percentage of incorrectly labeled data. We played with this in a recent blog post which was published at ICLR. So if you want to do experiments with ImageNet, we'll look at that paper. We are working on relabeling ImageNet validation set. Maybe 10%, 15% of things have to be changed. So, but in this data set, they were saying, okay, we have a spurious clue. So it's funny, like for skis, what they call spurious background is the snow. Like it's a little bit, I would say, counterintuitive, no? But this is because the training set are data from shops. And the same thing with snorkel. Here it's the other way around. Well, the spurious is the natural environment. So, and here is the, I think it shows that people do not fully appreciate what is happening. Yeah, here we have it in detail. So in the fungi data set, this Fungitastic is a newer data set. It has hundreds of classes, and it's very important to recognize the background because certain mushrooms only grow on certain types of soils. So then we will get to the data in a minute. Then there is a data called Sporious, where they train, they have a training set where all so, okay, this is about recognition of breeds of dogs. I don't know, Corgi, Dachshund, I don't know, this is English Bulldog. And they do this thing that they present the training data. The dogs are presented in one type of background. So, I don't know, this one would be on grass. And then in the test set, it's presented on a different types of background. Okay, so of course this is adversarial, and surprise, surprise, if you use the background, you will be hurt. So for us, it's like a challenging one. And then there is this data set Stanford dogs, where the background is random. So more or less, the background doesn't help you at all. So these last two are examples of data sets where background will hurt you, and of course then they show a method that ignores background does well. This one, background doesn't help you, so it's just good at spurious correlation, so again, doesn't help you. But if we look at our results, if there are these informative and adversarial, so we were just looking at the data set, I think, the animal. So if you look at the standard ImageNet, if you take the full image, you don't get much better by doing this is some sort of combination technique. So if you do the foreground and full combination, you get a little bit of an improvement. By the way, this column is the same thing, same data, but with corrected or cleaned up labels. So if you see a paper on ImageNet validation which claims more than like 85% accuracy, beware, they are probably somehow overfitting the incorrect labels. So for the clean data, we get very small improvement. Fine. Same thing in this. This is another data set which has ImageNet classes but different data. So separating, so just using the foreground helps. This is just the use of, let's say, the resolution, better use of the resolution of this one, ConvNext. And this is the SIGLIP, like we try to do this for visual language models as well. And with this hard ImageNet, where you have adversarial backgrounds, you get a small drop. And this one is almost fully due to the fact that the segmentation of the foreground fails in these percentages. So this experiment shows class agnostic segmentation before recognition is a challenge. If you have adversarial situations, then of course separating the foreground and background and combining it in a robust way gives you huge benefits. So the point of this table is that we want to show that it is possible to use the background where it is informative, which is here, because the background tells you in certain contexts of ImageNet classes what class it is more likely to be. And you don't have to be hurt against the full on this adversarial backgrounds. Of course, if you use the full image and someone changes the backgrounds intentionally to hurt you, it will hurt. On this SIGLIP, which is one of the latest CLIP models, the changes are much smaller. So somehow this suggests that in this first line shows that if you just use the foreground, you will, on those where the background plays a role, the SIGLIP, the CLIP model, uses it somehow correctly or somehow benefits from it. It can be hurt, of course, on these spurious, in these data which were manufactured so that the background is hurting you, but not at all, nowhere near as much as in the trained models. And you still gain a little bit from the robust combination, but very small parts. So somehow probably these large models do something inside which could be thought of as robust combination of the foreground and background. Yeah. So some description of the data sets. Okay, so summary, we have just a few minutes left. We showed, like in the last part, we showed that that should be R. That we can start with foreground localization, and when background is beneficial, we can use it, and yet we can be robust. So it's not like this whole spurious correlations means handle the background appropriately. Then, still, despite segment anything titles, currently this localization before recognition is possible, but not in full generality. We've talked about this, and the other two things I talked about is that you can achieve better results in applications and in real world visual recognition if you deal with prior shift, do not expect IID data, and that 0-1 cost should not be used always, and if you use classifier calibration, you can get results which are superior than a blind use of the standard setup. And with that, thank you. This concludes the talk. I have to say thank you to my collaborators who worked on these two work on the foreground background and these on the domain shifts and non-zero one costs. And maybe there is time for a question or two. If there is one else, okay, thank you.
Questions, please. Questions, please.
Yeah, okay.
Antonio.
Hello.
Thanks a lot for a very nice talk. So, getting to your second part of the presentation about this foreground segmentation, as you already said in the slide, segmentation itself is not possible to solve without knowing the class. So you can get some context-dependent segmentation. Then this defeats the purpose if you try to...
Sure. It's a little bit better. It's a little bit better. So for...
Just to finalize my real question, can you see a looping there that after some first recognition of the segmented part, you do some recognition-based segmentation and then try to see if there's a consistency in the labels?
Okay, so in some of those cases, like with the mushrooms, you can do a prompt like segment a mushroom in the image or segment mushrooms in the image. So in fine-grained recognition, your problem is to recognize one of the 500 mushrooms, and there it works because you can give this high-level prompt, segment a mushroom to a VLM type of thing. Then the same thing is true for animals, and with the owl, you have something called an objectness. So somehow they've seen many segmented things, and what we do is get regions of high local maxima of objectness, and then they somehow cluster them. It's another story. So you don't. I think that the point is that it's the very fine. Okay, you need a foreground background segmentation for fine-grained recognition. For the fine-grained, you have a superclass somewhere high up, like animal, plant, and so on, which you can segment. So I think the answer will be segmentation on some very coarse level of the hierarchy, and then you use it for these fine decisions. But surely you cannot say, at the moment, at least I'm not aware of a method which say, segment all the objects for me, and then I will do foreground background. You can't. I think there is no existing software, but this example with the people, segment whatever you segment, deal, and so on is probably possible. Yeah, if we have one more
Last question.
Thanks very much for your great talk. My question is regarding what's the role of active inference? So you mentioned a quote from Google, the animal quote from Google that they training, and that's basically the strategy that's being followed at the moment. A very interesting and upcoming application is robotics and different application. So my question is, you highlighted several problems that have been existed since ever, also many years ago, and that it's robots. So do you think the next 5 to 10 years, we have to work on the active inference where robots have to actively engage with the global environment to become better, or shall we keep pushing until our errors become marginal?
I think this is a very broad question, but I think there's a lot of research in reinforcement learning which goes into this direction. Also, in very many cases, the environment gives you feedback. Also, I think you are going the right direction in that I didn't talk about that, but we unnaturally split 2 phases of a recognition system, training and deployment. And if we think about ourselves as a recognition system, these 2 phases are intertwined and should be intertwined, and maybe we need some supervision. And part of the story, which I didn't talk about, but I'm interested in this, is like when I'm performing, actually this is happening with the mushroom recognition. People do that, and if the system doesn't know, then you have these super experts that you have to be able to say, I don't know, and the expert says this, or we go for DNA analysis. So there's one more thing, be able to say, I don't know, and then something new can happen. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, I thought, okay, this is partially a summer school, so we have to start from the basics, and, okay. No, but good, thank you, very good question, so thank you again.
Okay, we would like to thank Alexander, please.